You may be surprised by what you see on a typical day aboard the Starship Enterprise. Specifically on Deck 4, Commander Data could come around the corner with a wooden pipe dressed as Sherlock Holmes. The bridge officers could come by in full sailing regalia, ready to sail on the high seas of the 1800s. Even a Klingon in a cowboy hat has graced these corridors. But today, everyone gives a wide berth to the junior officer carrying the longsword, dressed in standard issue gray physical training attire and carrying the heavy sword over his shoulder. Wess Kirkpatrick makes his way to Holodeck 3 to fulfill a promise that he made years ago. Wess grew up on starships and came from a family with a long tradition with the fleet. But his mother was a geneticist who discovered a peculiar quirk in the genes of all humanoid species in the galaxy. The expression of this quirk would likely never have been discovered at all if not for a single planet rich with a particular radioactive ore that made magic possible. Or at least what appeared to be magic to the underdeveloped population of that planet. Every moment Wess had growing up that was not spent on a starship was spent on Roke. His mother spent 25 years studying the ore's strange properties that could make fantasy stories come to life. Indeed, the whole planet felt like a fantasy novel, and the summer shore leaves Wess spent on Roke were filled with swords and symbology. The inhabitants had somehow discovered that symbols could be inscribed on objects and on the skin to draw out this radioactive energy and give it form. The sword Wess carried onto the holodeck was one such object, and a closer inspection revealed intricate symbols inscribed on the blade. On any planet or starship in the galaxy so far explored, these runes were mere decorations, but on Roke, that was a different matter. Wess had spent the last few months coding a holodeck program to simulate the symbol effect. While on Roke, a friend of his father's had trained him in the art of manipulating the symbol energy with a blade, and Wess had promised his swordmaster to keep it in practice. The lifespan of the people of Roke is shorter than that of humans, and Master Otaxis died about 4 years ago. Wess was his last pupil, and after his death he made it a personal goal to keep this specific art alive. But it was easier said than done. Being a Starfleet officer took its own level of dedication, and practicing on Roke was not an option for an upcoming officer in the fleet. When Wess transferred to the Enterprise a few months ago, he saw his chance. He coded this simulation carefully, and it was accurate as he could make it. He called up the simulation and walked to the center of the training field. It was, in appearance, just like the one from his childhood, a wide, open, dusty clearing surrounded by lush forest. As Wess assumed his stance, sword held in front, red light flickered from the symbols. But there was no feeling to it, no surge of power. This simulation looked good, but you could not simulate the tingly rush of energy moving from your feet to your arms. It was better than nothing, though, and Wess had been very particular with the coding so that only the most precise movements would project the desired effect. Symbol ore was rare anyway, and it took an incredible amount to maintain any effect for long. The whole planet's core had to be made of the stuff to see any of this effect. Roke was a rare gem indeed. Despite its underdeveloped status, Starfleet had established an undercover research initiative there, but once the limitations of the symbol effect were established, any hope of turning it into a helpful commodity was abandoned. Since the death of his master and his wife, no one had been allowed back on the planet. Wess was lost in thought about such things when he suddenly realized he was not alone. He wheeled into a defensive stance, barely dodging the initial strike of a Bathleth blade. Lieutenant Commander Worf stares Wess down with a menacing smile. "Impressive," he remarks, pulling back his blade to a defensive stance. "Now attack," he barked. In shock, Wess stands dumbfounded. Sensing his hesitation, the Klingon attacks again. Wess parries the attack as Mr. Worf shouts, "Attack!" Wess does, pushing the Klingon towards the edge of the clearing. "Good," Mr. Worf remarks, continuing to smile, baring his teeth. It turned out that Wess was not the only one training that day in the holodeck. Losing track of the time, Mr. Worf had stepped into Wess's simulation to give him a piece of his mind, only to be pleasantly surprised to find a, as he put it, fellow warrior. Wess had seen Mr. Worf many times on the bridge of the Enterprise, but since the two worked in different departments and Wess was junior staff, they rarely interacted directly. But suddenly, Wess found himself sparring with the imposing Klingon officer. He did not speak in more than broken sentences at first. Defend, he would shout, with an occasional approval or criticism, like training on the real Rokugan with his master. After the battle, Mr. Worf insisted that Wess join him for a drink to cool down and had lots of questions about Wess's training. Despite his exhaustion, Wess was not allowed to refuse this invitation. Personal log. Stardate 48076.94. Today marks 6 months I have been assigned to the Enterprise under the command of Captain Picard. I would like to say that time has flown by, but it hasn't. I have been having a great deal of difficulty making friends with my own peers. While it is nice to be noticed by the primary bridge personnel, I'm still not one of the family. These individuals have been serving with each other for almost 7 years, while I am still the new guy. I'm running into the same troubles from my academy days. All my accomplishments are filled into 2 categories. Of course, he's a Kirkpatrick. Or he just got promoted because he's a Kirkpatrick. So far, I've managed to escape my least favorite version. He should have done better. After all, he's a Kirkpatrick. I guess one friend is a start, but with friends like Mr. Worf, I may not live long enough to make more. I guess I've gotten this far, and at least being in a new place, no one has asked any favors of me yet. After all, what favor could I grant, or more specifically my uncle/father could give them, that is more significant than serving on the Federation flagship? Tomorrow I'm going to be 20 years old, and emboldened by my positive interactions with Mr. Worf, I plan on trying to make some new friends. As the lights slowly come on in Wess's room, simulating daybreak, he lies still, waiting for the alarm to ring. Growing up sleeping in space, you never fall into the standard day and night routine of Earth, despite all the effort put into making the ship feel as normal as possible. But how do you program normal for 1,000 different individuals from hundreds of worlds? Wess rolls to his side as the alarm chimes, facing the music box on the far wall of his quarters. The box was a gift from his mother when he accepted the assignment on the Enterprise. A little piece of home, she called it. It was made on Roke and belonged to Rotaxis' wife, Miss Millie. Spending your summers on an undeveloped planet, after having all the comforts of the modern era, was something. You get used to 10 months of the year eating replicator meals and then beam down to a planet and eat food that was grown by someone in their garden, or slaughtered by a butcher for about 2 months, sometimes longer, when his mom was assigned to the planet for a time, and also during the Cardassian War. Wess spent almost a year on the planet during that time with his cousins, while their parents served on the USS Monroe. Roke's significance had been an accidental discovery, and the story of Wess's family recruiting the inhabitants for a special mission to save the quadrant had made them famous. In all that time spent on the planet during his childhood, Wess's favorite part of the experience was the little music box. Training with Rotaxis was fun, and playing with his cousins and brother in the trees around the village was great. But the very first time he saw that little box and turned the crank to hear the little melody, Wess had wanted it. He used to sit on the floor and turn the crank while he thought no one was home, but apparently he was not as sneaky as he thought. Before Miss Millie had passed, she gave the box to Wess's mother, and told her to give it to him when she thought he was ready for it. Wess rose on his bed and turned the little crank, listening to the now familiar tune. He closed his eyes and was there again, on Roke. Not even a holodeck could conjure that kind of mental image. He heard his personal datapad chime with fresh messages and was immediately transported back to the present. There were 8 personal messages and 2 work-related ones. He checked the work messages first. They were mainly duty roster changes, none of which affected him. Wess called the replicator for tea and grabbed it on his way to his chair. The first message is from his parents, a video of them singing happy birthday to him. They ask him to write or call soon, and Wess checked the time. His father worked the morning shift on Planitia Fleet Yards on Mars and was likely still asleep. In his mind, Wess tells himself he does not want to wake his parents, but deep down, he knows better. Wess had barely spoken to his father since he had took the position on the Enterprise, instead of a position on Mars under his father's command. It was a good offer, but Wess was not an engineer and he had no desire to work on the fleet reconciliation project his father was head of. He knew refurbishing old ships was necessary, but he was much more interested in deep space assignments. When he told his father, Wess's dad told him that he was not ready for deep space, which offended Wess deeply. The following two messages were from Wess's Academy friends, Nathan and Jamie. Jamie is training on the medical frigate, the USS Nightingale, and Nathan is currently stationed on the USS Cairo as part of their operations staff. They both wish Wess a happy birthday and barrage him with questions about his personal life. Jamie wants to know if Wess is dating anyone, as he himself had recently settled down with an officer on the Nightingale and was constantly reminding Nathan and Wess they needed to meet someone. Wess laughed at the banter between his friends and then checked the remaining messages. The rest were mostly from his cousins. Wess's family was a tight-knit group. His father and his uncle served together on the Monroe for decades, and the kids grew up running up and down the corridors of the big Ambassador-class starship for most of their childhood until the war. Wess shuddered at the thought. He put down his pad and went to the closet to get ready. He had a few hours till his shift, so he thought about going to the Arboretum. Maybe Jamie was right, and it was time for him to go out and interact with some people. Right now, the closest thing he had to a friend on the ship was Mr. Worf, and with a friend like him, Wess may not live long enough to make more, he thought to himself. He dressed and headed out the door. Morning light poured through Liz's window. She could hear the terns at the river looking for their first meal of the day. As she rolled out of bed, she could smell her mother cooking downstairs. She rolled her eyes and went to her mirror. Her mother never really could cook, but it never stopped her from trying. Picking up her hairbrush and brushing her hair, she thought about her father. When he was alive, he did all the cooking and had taught her a love of preparing fine meals. Usually she got up earlier than her mother, but last night she had stayed up late in the evening drying and preparing the herbs and flowers she had picked to prepare for her trip to Cross. Once a month she had made a long journey to the capital to sell her medicinal herbs, a business passed down 3 generations in her household. Her mother was not much help in preparing the herbs either, and as the trip grew closer she had fallen behind in their work. To meet their quota, she would have to make one more trip to the forest to pick from the glade her father had planted many decades ago. The herbs only grew in the forest and nowhere else, no matter what the village people tried. The main reason the village existed was to farm and harvest these herbs. But as more advanced medicines had been developed by the scientists across the sea in Liqueur, the demand for herbs had waned. Sure, those medicines were cheaper, but to her mind, the healing herbs of the forest were far superior in quality. The town had been steadily declining over the last few years, but she and her mother had managed to earn a modest living selling the herbs to vendors in Cross. That is, until the meteor hit. 8 months had passed since then, and business was booming as the world slowly turned more chaotic. The demand for medicines exported to other nations was so high that herbs were once again sought to meet that demand. The extra strain meant that she had been working twice as hard as she was this time last year, though she was still careful not to over-harvest the clearing. She was exhausted and had been trying to convince her mother to let her hire a few hands to help her at least prepare the herbs. But her mother would have none of that, insisting that they could get the work done. Liz washed her hands and face in a basin close to her dresser and dried them. There had been reports that monsters were sneaking into neighboring villages at night and ransacking their farmland. On her last trip north, as she passed through the neighboring town of Salt, headed to Cross, she had seen a lot of unsavory men gathering at the governor's office. She knew the governor, Allen, well, as they had grown up playing together in Arlia before the family moved north to Salt. She had kept a correspondence with Alan over the years and visited him in the city on many of her trips through, but recently his letters had stopped coming, and when she saw the men gathering at the governor's house, she decided not to pay him a visit on her last trip. Also, recent personal events made seeing Alan awkward. The world seemed like it was changing quickly, and not for the better. As Liz went down the stairs, she was already planning the rest of her day. Because she had stayed up and completed preparing the herbs to dry the night before, she could go straight to the forest this morning and collect more. She should have just enough time to prepare them for her trip to Cross. On her way out, Liz took some toast that her mother had burned and some jam. She declined the rest of breakfast, offering the excuse that she was running late from having overslept. Before her mother could protest, she was out the door and down the lane. Rounding the corner, she slowed her pace. Now out of sight of her door, she took in the crisp morning air and turned south to cross the bridge headed out of town. Her home was close to the south edge of the continent near the forest. The closest home was the mayor's residence, and the local carpenter Theodore lived across from them as well. The town was small and getting smaller by the year. Not long ago, she had helped the mayor prepare a census for the King of Cross, and the little village was down to about 20 families. This meant a lot of empty houses, still owned by families who would visit from time to time to keep them up. But for most of the year, the town was incredibly quiet. Too quiet, Liz thought to herself. Running late today, she heard a familiar voice to her right. Mayor Regis was emerging from his own home. Regis was an elder of the village and the oldest person who lived there, well into his 90s, but still spry and able. He had taken to a cane about 5 years ago, but this had hardly slowed him down any. Since her father's death, she had often gone to his home when she and her mother were at odds, and to her he was like a grandfather. In his youth, he had been a knight of the King of Cross, and had fought in many battles and traveled most of the world. He was a fountain of wisdom and stories. The kind old man had settled here decades ago with an enchantress of runology. She had asked him a long time ago why the two great warriors and travelers had come here of all places to retire. Officially, he said that they came because at the end of their travels they looked for a quiet place to retire, but a few years ago he had told her the truth. His wife Edith had received a vision that a man of strange blue and black garb would appear in the forest with a sword of light, and that this chosen warrior would save the world from a great calamity. Once she reported the vision to the King of Cross, he gave them one final mission, to await this warrior in the town of Arlia. Edith had passed years ago, but Regis said he still clung to his mission as a knight of the king. Of course, when Liz heard the story, she didn't believe it. Sometimes it was hard to tell if the mayor was telling you something that happened or something that he made up that he found amusing. The idea of the warrior appearing in the forest seemed a bit cliché to her mind. The mayor approached and his face was warm, but she could tell he had something grave on his mind. "What is it?" she asked. "Oh, nothing. Just a bit stiff today," he replied, but she did not believe him. "Going to the forest?" She nodded, still trying to read his mood. She had rarely seen him like this. He usually was laid back and easygoing, but she had spent enough time with him to know when something was bothering him. "Perhaps you should not go today," he continued. "There have been reports of monsters in the world, and I fear they may be encroaching in on our forest." Liz sighed. She found it hard to believe this was all that was bothering him, but she knew that if he did not want to tell her what he was thinking, it was fruitless to try to get it out of him. As much as she loved the old man, he was stubborn and rarely came to the point. "Have they been spotted in the forest?" she asked, not even attempting to hide her annoyance. "No," he said flatly, "but—" She cut him off. "So I should be fine." The mayor paused and clicked his tongue on the roof of his mouth. She knew he would not forbid her to go. It was a matter of livelihood, and he also knew that she could take care of herself. If he was not willing to tell her the reason for his request to remain in the village, then she would not yield. "There are also rumors of unsavory men and salt to the north," he said. He looked at her more sternly than she was used to. "If you encounter any strangers in the forest or the village, you should not speak to them, but report to me at once." She did not like how grave he looked and felt some of her stubbornness melt away. But then that warm smile returned and he said, "If you go, Be very careful. The world is not what it was just a few years ago, and we must all be vigilant." With that, he turned on his heel and left. She wondered if she should return home and get her knife from the house. She carried a large hunting knife with her that her father had used on the roads north just in case. She had learned to use it from her father and Regis, but the occasion had never actually arisen where she had to use it. But there was something very serious about how Regis had addressed her today. But the more she thought about having to go home and explain to her mother why she had returned, the less she liked the idea of going back. Besides, he had not forbidden her from going to the forest, and it was always safe. She weighed it all out in her mind, and as strange as the encounter with the mayor had been, she had been to the forest every week since she was a child and had never carried the knife before. The world may be changing, but here in Arlia, change came slower than in most places, and she was sure everything would be fine. She turned and crossed the bridge that marked the edge of town and headed into the forest. "You've reported for duty early again, Lieutenant." Wess heard a familiar voice from over his shoulder say. It was Commander Data, and Wess nodded to the android officer. "Yes, sir," he replied, looking up. Wess had decided against going to the Arboretum after all. He had made a whole list of excuses in his head, of course. In the end, though, he just followed his feet to the bridge, where he had been trying to blend in at his science station. But very little escapes the attention of Commander Data. Mr. Data cocked his head in a sort of quizzical fashion, as if he did not quite understand something, but Wess maintained a close watch on his panel, hoping that the android would not press him about his promptness. He stared at the sensor logs coming in. There was a particular energy pattern that caught his attention. It was faint, but he thought he recognized it. He selected the waveform and isolated the reading to get a closer look. "Have you found something?" the commander asked, and Wess nodded absent-mindedly. "I think I recognize this pattern here," he explained, and Commander Data stood up straight. "Accessing," he said aloud, with his head twitching slightly as if he were reading an unseeable text. "Found," he remarked. "Time displacement waves," Wess said, interrupting him. "Yes," Commander Data said, puzzled. "How did you know?" he asked. Wess stared at the reading. It was close to their position, but very faint, originating from a planet in the system they were passing. "I've seen them before," he answered. This is all very ironic, thought Captain Picard, sitting in his ready room, reading the history of the Guardian of Forever. Discovered by Captain Kirk and his crew in the 23rd century, the Gate is a sentient machine capable of sending anyone to any place and any time in the universe. Even today, the best scientists of the Federation did not understand how the technology worked, or even who built it. The only clues are the Gate itself and the ruins of a city nearby. The whole story had intrigued him for many years. Even in his younger days, his professors in archaeology classes speculated about this ancient, powerful civilization that existed on the order of 1 billion years ago. Scanning through the data, he found also that the Gate had been used again about 25 years ago on a mission by Admiral Kirkpatrick, then commander, and his brother Chief Engineer Robert Kirkpatrick. The two men commandeered their own ship, the USS Tupelo, and went to the Gate, passing through it with two others to the planet Roke, to retrieve a blood sample from Roke of the past. This sample would save the population of Roke from death and reveal a significant threat to the Federation in the process. This team of 4 would go on to save the Federation from this deadly disease. And now, 25 years later, the son of Robert Kirkpatrick, nephew of the Admiral, would discover these readings matching the time gate while serving on another enterprise. He chuckled to himself. "What's so funny?" asked Commander Riker. Indeed, what was funny, he thought. This was not the first time his new enterprise seemed to be retracing its predecessor's steps. By this point, it should almost be considered normal. "What is funny," he replied after some thought, "is that no matter how big the universe or how much we learn about it, it's still a small world after all." This was an exciting moment, though, an opportunity to possibly learn more about or even solve one of the greatest mysteries of the last 2 centuries. It would be an exciting day, one he was looking forward to very much. Wess followed Commander Riker down the ship corridor to the transporter room. He had nearly had a heart attack when the commander called his name to join the away mission. Commander Riker had noticed Wess's dumbstruck face and politely asked, "Nervous?" Wess nodded, and the commander smiled. "Well, I checked our records, and you did meet the qualifications for a beam down." Wess nodded again. He had never actually been on a real away mission, but he had done the allotted simulated training and was qualified. Wess wondered why he had been asked at all. Commander Data usually went down as the most qualified science officer. He had a theory, but he hoped he was wrong. Wess decided he needed to know. "Sir, why was I assigned to the away mission?" Commander Riker smiled. "Captain Picard thought you might like the opportunity to follow in your father's footsteps." There it was again. He discovered something overlooked by other survey teams and vessels because of his expertise, but he was on the away mission because of his family's name. Wess no longer felt nervous, now he felt determined. Bolstered with this resolve, he stepped onto the transporter pad. As their matter materialized on the planet, Geordi LaForge looked around, taking in the terrain of barren rock. The air had a faint smell of ozone, and the breathable oxygen levels were pretty low. Dr. Crusher had prepared a hypospray and given him a quick shot before they stepped onto the transporter pads to open up their lung passages to help them take in more air. Lieutenant Kirkpatrick had his tricorder already out and was taking readings. Geordi smiled as he took out his own tricorder. Data had described the young man as a capable and eager-to-please officer. That said, Geordi had not worked with the young man yet, but he certainly knew the young man's parentage. Robert Kirkpatrick Sr. was a personal hero of Geordi's, and he remembered fondly sitting in lectures at the Academy and listening to the legend speak. Geordi picked up a reading just behind them and turned to tune his tricorder to it. "There's a fairly large structure to the south," he commented, and Lieutenant Kirkpatrick added that the time displacement waves emanated from the structure. Mr. Worf took the lead, and the lieutenant walked beside Geordi, still intently reading his tricorder. Geordi could not help but smile. It seemed not all that long ago he was wearing a red uniform trying to impress the captain with his competence, and the young officer was a little like looking into a mirror. The young man was fidgety, and it amused Geordi. As they walked, the dome came into view, and it was larger than Geordi imagined. It's about 50 meters high, and was twice that in diameter. The surface was as smooth as glass. Except for a large crack in the top of the dome, the radiation was leaking out of the crack, and Geordi could see the energy waves through the EMS view on his visor. Commander Riker walked to the dome and ran his hands along the surface. He then touched his comm badge to give his report. As soon as Data answered, a roar was heard from the ship. "Everything all right?" Commander Riker asked, and Geordi turned his tricorder skyward to get a reading. The ship was passing over them, and the time displacement waves created space distortions that buffeted the ship. Data explained all this to the captain and the commander, noting that the original Enterprise crew recorded hitting a similar disturbance when they discovered the Guardian Forever. Geordi noticed the lieutenant was still scanning the dome. He walked over to the younger man. "What do you think?" he asked. "Maybe a lab?" Geordi nodded. "I think there's a door near here," the lieutenant said, pointing to a general area in front of him. Geordi looked through his visor, and sure enough, he could see seams for the door, which folded inward. But there was no way anyone could see those seams without his visor. Intrigued, Geordi asked the younger officer, "How do you figure?" The young man pointed at an indentation in the ground. "I think there was a panel here that connected to a door mechanism based on the power running to an incomplete circuit somewhere beyond the wall." Geordi kneeled by the little hole in the dirt. The younger officer knelt beside him. Geordi pulled out a small power converter from his tool belt and used it to complete the circuit. Sure enough, the door opened inward with a massive rush of air. The room inside must have been a vacuum, and fairly large as the room sucked in air for several seconds. Geordi patted the young officer on the shoulder. "Good call," he said, and the two of them went together to scan inside. Riker removed his hand torch and shined it into the large central room. The journey here had been a maze of dark corridors, and Mr. Worf had led them directly to the center. They had all split up once they reached the cavernous room, but Riker stuck close to the lieutenant. It was his first away mission, and he wanted to make sure the young officer stayed out of trouble. The young man seemed to ignore him, totally engrossed in what he was doing. He followed his tricorder to the very center of the room. Wes's leg faltered on a piece of terrain, and Riker shined his light at the officer's feet. It was a transparent porthole-like doorway, and the young man nodded at the commander and stepped inside. Riker followed to the doorway and leaned on the frame, propping his foot in the opening. He watched the young man work, scanning the boundaries of the room, which reminded Riker of a clear transporter pad. Geordi shouted from behind him. "I think I found a conduit for power," he said. Riker stood up straight as all the lights in the room came on. The portal slammed shut right in front of him, coming down from the ceiling with a loud thud. He was sure that if he had not taken his foot off the frame, it would have likely sheared in half. He grabbed the door at the bottom and yelled for Mr. Worf. Worf came quickly, and together they heaved at the door trying to lift it, but it didn't budge. "Geordi, shut it down!" Riker shouted as the room became brighter inside. Lieutenant Kirkpatrick tried to talk to him through the glass like material, shouting, but Riker could not hear him. Worf pounded on the transparent portal, but it barely flexed, and the room grew brighter and brighter. Riker shielded his eyes and shouted to Geordi again. "I can't disengage the conduit," he shouted back. "It's fused together." Dr. Crusher was now with them, and she was holding her tricorder up, shielding her eyes and watching the readings. Riker read the pulse of the young man. His heart raced above 180 beats per minute, and then it vanished. There was a loud whirring sound, like an engine spinning down, and the room grew dim again. As his eyes adjusted, Riker looked intently for the young man, but he was gone.